About democratic waves. Okay, so today we'll be talking about democratic waves. When we live in a world where most of the countries on the face of Earth are democratic, of course, they didn't all morph into democratic states at once, but they did that in waves. And we'll look exactly what those waves are, when they happened, and what their implications were. So usually we think that democracies flourish in modern societies. But first of all, what are modern societies? So generally accepted, it means that they're post-industrial economies, they have affluence, they have specialized occupations, social mobility, and an urban education population. This beautiful gentleman right here is Seymour Martin Lipset, who carried out a theory that said that if states are modernized, so meaning that they have a stable economy, they went through industrialization, they have an urbanized and educated population, they are most likely to be democracies. So therefore, modernization very much correlates with democracy. But of course, there are always exceptions to rules. In this case, it's the Middle East, which has accumulated masses of wealth through their oil production, but they are not democracies. So why is it that liberal democracies seem to be the path for modern societies? Well, Lipset offers a few arguments. One of them is that if we don't have to fight over resources, and we don't have to fight such as oil, for instance, and we don't have to fight over wealth, and if everyone has, let's say, a very standard income, there is less source of conflict. We don't want to fight someone for something if we all have it. So that's the general idea. Second one is, of course, that this economic security that you're gaining raises the quality of governance, because if everyone exactly has the same power, which power we'll also get back to, it reduces the incentives for corruption. You cannot take leverage of someone who is not as well off economically if they're doing okay. Then, of course, there's also interest groups to reinforce liberal democracy. Education and urbanization also make a difference. They can hold accountability and promote democracy like that. Van Hanen also, as I kind of alluded to it previously, says that equal distribution of power also adds to the fact that they become democracies. Again, equal distribution of power means you can't take leverage over someone who doesn't have it. So therefore, it's a more democratic state of being. Again, China is an exception to the rule. They've been creating modern societies and been, in some cases, even the forerunner in modernizing. But again, they're not a democracy. So this brings us to the waves of democracy. So Samuel Huntington was an American political scientist. He was very famously known for the essay or the book, A Clash of Civilizations. And he also postulated and categorized waves of democracy and when these states morphed into democracies. So what is the wave of democratization in itself? So it is a group of transitions from non-democratic to democratic regimes that occurs within a specific period of time, and that significantly outnumbers transitions in the opposite direction during that period. Of course, Dornspleet, who's also an American scientist, says that the problematic thing about his waves and his categorization, which we'll see in a second, is that he doesn't exactly define what he thinks are democracies and what are not democracies. So if you cannot be sure to what extent a state is a democracy, how can you make a very distinctive difference between authoritarian regimes and democracies? How can you be distinct about when these waves happened if you're not being clear about what is defined as a democracy and what is not? So that was the general criticism towards the waves, and we'll see exactly what they are in a second. So the first wave of democracy, it happened from 1828 to 1926. And in this time period, nearly 30 countries transitioned, which is quite a lot. And some backsliding, of course, occurred. There was democracies that were overthrown by fascists, communists. There were military dictatorships. And Huntington even called them reverse waves from 1922 to 1942. We saw the rise of Nazism, and so that didn't fit into it. So we call it the first reverse wave of democratization. These transitions were also slow. For example, we have political competitions that, which, okay, they were provided by elite, but they gradually broadened the right to vote. So, for example, the British expansion of the vote was gradual, and so were the U.S. voting rights. If I'm correct, the U.S. introduced the first right to vote in 1789, which at that time only granted the vote to all property-owning white males. And if you look at that, it's actually only 6% of the population. And that's not very inclusive, but it definitely was a start. And then 100 years later, Black men in the northern states were allowed to vote, and then in 1920, women had the right to vote. And only in 1994, some people don't even realize that, only in 1994 did Native Americans have the right to vote. So it took a very long time to make an equal voting electorate. And therefore, the US really serves as a good example of what a gradual extension of vote means. Okay, so the second wave was from 1943 to 1962. It began during the Second World War and continued until the 1960s. So some of the new democracies did not consolidate. There were elected rulers in several Latin American states, which were quickly overthrown by military coups. And then, of course, for example, with the United Nations and the symbolism of this phoenix rising from the ashes, so did the new democracies after World War II. These post-war democracies were introduced by victorious allies, supported by local partners, of course. They received a lot of economic aid. The Marshall Plan is famous to everyone, I think. At that time, political parties started playing a pivotal role in transition as well. And we have what is called the first generation of democracies, which had merged when parties were seen as a source of carrion rather than progress. But then at the time of the Second World War, parties had emerged as leading instruments for democracy. And of course, we also have the example of Germany, which even codified in their legal system that parties should perpetuate democracy. So, of course, in some case, effective completion was reduced by the emergence of a single party. For example, the Christian Democrats in Italy, the Liberal Democrats in Japan. But Germany, especially Germany and Japan, were two political processes that are very characteristic to the second wave, because we have on one side Germany, which was very much focused on post-war rebuilding of Germany, built as a democracy. So was Italy and Japan. But we also have a lot of other big countries transferring, which is the second part of the second wave, which is decolonization, the granting of independence to other colonies. India is the best example for that. So India became a democratic state after they became or broke off from the British Empire. Then we have the third wave of democratization from 1974 to 1991. This happened, of course, in the final quarter of the 20th century, the ending of right-wing dictatorships, Greece, Portugal, Spain, in the 1970s. And this was also very, very the first wave that was very global. You see in the other parts, it was mainly Western states or only one area of the world. Now we have the dictatorship in Greece collapsing, in Portugal and Spain, but also much of the military dictatorships and the generals in Latin America retreated in the 1980s. Of course, then the collapse of communism with the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe also led to a lot of states democratizing. And because with the end of the Cold War, the US and the European Union tried to push also for states to, keep transitioning. And the fall of the Berlin Wall with the Cold War is a very nice symbolic wave of democratization. The Iron Curtain has now fallen. And then some people think that this post-Cold War world or status quo should be considered a wave of its own, because it was just a very significant part of the world. All of Eastern Europe practically democratized. But some people argue that that's just a natural transgression of how things were worked out, and they call it the end of history. And the end of history is a term that we use to describe a political, economic, or social system that has developed to such an extent that it pretty much represents an evolutionary process in itself. So despite concerns, considering all of this and considering that we've had reverse movements and very gradual democratization, democracy has been pretty stable over the past few years. But of course, we also have to think about democracy as a notion and what those reverse treatments mean. So is it not a national transgression if we have setbacks, or is that just really inherent to any type of change that you have to experience setbacks? One of the best examples for that as well, that challenges the notion of democratization, is the Arab Spring. Right? So rulers were forced down from power. It was hoped that the protests that happened in North Africa and Middle East would lead to democracies. Libya was in a worse situation than pre-Arab Spring, actually. And I'm from Germany, and coming from a Western perspective, what I don't like is that a lot of Westerners believe that modernization means westernization, and that certainly doesn't. We think, oh, these states, kind of white mind burden type of mentality. Oh, all of these states in the Middle East or even in the third world countries, they just need democracy. Often at times they're kind of like velvet gloves that try to overshadow our real intentions by just wanting to exploit these countries. But we always sort of go ahead and think, oh, we want to bring democracy, but then we do it by force. As I said, democracy cannot be enforced, especially not with force. At the core of democracy is free will, and you cannot force anything down anyone's throat, especially not democracy. That goes against the whole concept of democracy. And it has also failed when we try to do that. I mean, US, British, and French military interventions to restore democracies in countries has failed to a large extent. And the Mosquito and Downs even offer arguments for that. And that is simply because US, British, and French policy was not so much, as I said, oh, we want to give them democracy and oh, we want them to have a better life, but it's more of an ulterior motive. So to kind of alter some aspects of the target state policies. And of course, the chances of success are considerably increased when it's a genuine attempt. So if we really want to stop a war or try to improve the situation in a country, it's usually done with the cooperation of other countries, right? Global challenges at this point can only be solved multilaterally and not only by one country. And it has to usually go through an international organization such as the UN or the EU. So again, as a slow recap as into what the process of democratization actually is first you have to have some sort of liberalization, right? This is initiative and initiation of reform. Usually it is because of recognition that the authoritarian rulers that are not working and that we need change. So that is the first liberalization process. Then you have the transition process, and here you have certain arrangements, you have predicaments that have to meet to make a new system of government. Then you have the consolidation process, which is the acceptance of this new system. We need to work for this new system, and then we also have evidence that it works. And the last part is that there is a deepening of this change. So in this case, democracy would evolve from the superficial to a very substantial part of life. It's no longer something arbitrary and idealistic, but a very substantial part of our lives. So given that the fact that right now most of the countries that we know, or that we think so at least, are democracies, we think that democracy has won as a form of government. But there are 3 points that I would like to highlight that makes it kind of problematic to say that. So first one is, if you look at the Freedom House, by the way, for people who don't know, the Freedom House is an American NGO that rates countries based on how free they are, freedom of speech, and freedom of movement, etc., and then categorizes them to make it more understandable. And so if you see their charts, which I can link below if you want to, you can see that democracies are actually unevenly spread throughout regions. You have a mix of free states, of non-free states, and some of them which are in between, which are hybrid states. So actually, the amount of non-democratic regimes is the norm and not democracies. The second claim is that certain regimes can appear to be democracies, but they're actually just hybrid regimes. And I'll explain what hybrid regimes are in a different video more in detail. But basically, Russia is an excellent example for a hybrid regime because, yes, they do have, for example, free elections, but their elections and their results never change. Papa Putin is very, very vehement about the fact that nothing changes there. And of course, the third one is that representative democracy has non-democratic alternatives. Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, of course, they have fallen and they're non-existent anymore. But they were both non-democratic regimes that were very popular at the time. Chile under Pinochet, Libya in 2011, they were also non-democratic regimes. And what most people don't also forget or tend to forget is contemporary China. They're doing very well, as I mentioned before. They're flag bearers, even in some sense, for technology in a lot of cases. But they're not a democracy, they're a non-democratic regime. And so China is a very good example that there is a system other than democracy that works. Whether it is good or not, that is up to interpretation, but personally I think it's not, as long when people are being hurt, but it shows that a country can modernize without being a democratic state. And that's this for now. I hope you liked it. Of course, if you have any questions, you can write me an email or you can write in the comments, and hope to see you soon.